Welcome, everyone. My name is Molly Stone, and I'm the Artistic Director at Catamount Arts. And I am joined here today by several artists who we are currently exhibiting in our Freed Family Gallery. And the exhibit is called Material Drawing Drawn to Touch. And I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Catherine French, the outgoing gallery director at Catamount. And Catherine, welcome. And you have a group of artists here that you are going to introduce us to. So please welcome and go right ahead.
Sure. Well, thank you, Molly. And I'm thrilled to be talking with this particular group of people. I've worked with them before, and I know they've certainly had a long history of working together. There is, I guess, maybe if people could sort of wave as I introduce you, Julie Shepley. There you go. Audrey Goldstein, Deborah Weisberg, and Michelle Samore. And they have, I think maybe I know, but if you could, between the four of you, talk about how you first got together, because this show is not the first time that you've come together to exhibit together. And I know that you're in constant conversation, and the show is kind of the result of how you've been speaking with each other and looking at each other's work over many years. And there's a lot of, I can see it within the gallery now, the conversation between different pieces. And I'd like to kind of know how you got started and how this all came about.
Well, I think that was an affinity for, we're drawn to each other by our affinity for material, working things out through material, and for experimentation with material. And Deborah Weisberg was the one that initiated having us form a group. And we knew each other before, but we got together as a group and to just discuss, you know, the possibility of showing together and how to and looking at our work in context with each other and getting ideas from each other or learning to solve problems materially with each other. So
it was basically a crit group?
Not really. We were not really anything formalized. It was just a way of, we saw these threads in our work that I felt were really taking this idea of four sculptors who work in space, and how some of our ideas about drawing and materials, and drawing with materials in some ways, and the materials driving the content and our collaboration between the handcraftedness and the content of our work forming or resonating with the meaning of in the work itself, whether it was abstract or in the case of Julie's work, architectural, or Michelle's work having a certain political context, and Audrey's work having a kind of charged psychological bend to it. So this is our third, so Catamount is, I think, you can correct me, group, if our third showing together. Fourth. Oh, it's our fourth one. So
Magda, we did Gasp.
We did Danforth when Catherine was
right. That's right.
And I built you a room.
Yeah, you got us a room. Yeah, you got us a museum.
It's a great room.
And then I had a show at Piano Craft Gallery. It was supposed to be a one-person show, and with my installation and my works on paper, collage works on paper, and there was an auxiliary space, and I curated this cohort of people into that space because the work is so strong, and it would be a complement to my own work, and a real conversation between how, between expanding the boundaries of drawing. So,
and it's been exciting to, because we've shown over such a long period of time, it's still very exciting that the work, though it had, I would say that our work has evolved. It hasn't changed dramatically. We were all mature artists when we got together and had a strong sense of ourselves and had already produced a good body of work. But to maintain the connections that we've had is really invigorating, and to continue to see the overlays between all of the work, as different as it is, our approaches are so similar in so many ways.
There's a sensuality, I think. I'm sorry, Audrey, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that there's this also very, very interesting overlap and kind of exchange of materials, not in a actual like Deb comes to my studio and takes my supply type of way, but although that could be fun. But you know, it's like even the use of like wood, where it shows up in Julie's work, and then it shows up in Michelle's work, and it shows up in my work, and you know, there's so many different crossovers with essential materials that create a visual language that that there's this almost like this we're playing a four-handed round of some kind of tennis game that we just keep on volleying back and forth over the years.
So you know, what's really interesting is that I think a lot of people, you know, you've all four of you have proved the point to me that drawing is not just an implement that you make a mark with on a piece of paper, that, you know, as sculptors, you're all drawing in space. And this is an exploration of a more, you know, kind of well, I don't think it's unconventional, but what people might conceive of as drawing, it pushes the boundaries. You're really kind of using materials in this very sensuous way. I think all of you, there's this, you know, I think the title for the show is very appropriate because you kind of want to touch all these things. I think as a museum person or a person who gets to install work, it's such a tactile pleasure of being able to physically touch these things as we get them up on the wall or however we're putting them, or installing them in the gallery. But would you, I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
I guess if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it's not usually what we think of as drawing, but it is drawing.
but you know, I'm glad that you mentioned the sensuousness of the work, the tactile quality. I mean, for me, that has so much to do with, and when Audrey was talking about connections of material, there's also connection of labor and action that go hand in hand with material and sort of result maybe in that sensuous quality that the work has. So when I look at all the work, whether it's Audrey's stitching or the piercing that goes on in Julie's work, or the layering in Deb's work and the twisting of wires, I mean, I can feel that action. And for me, that's a way of, you know, that holds all the work together as well as the materiality of it, and that sensuousness that you speak to.
Or energy. I mean, I think, you know, when you were, I mean, there's this movement. It's almost like, you know, a dancer draws in space, you know, by moving their body, that kind of kinetic movement. As three-dimensional pieces, I see this kind of energy going through all of it, that is very connected.
And there's a interest in the surprise that comes through process that we all have, of unexpected things happening that get excited and trigger emotional response and energy. So the materials create the energy as well as our response to them, the energy. You know, and the relationship between materials often creates tension or a sense of space, the layering, and you know, activates our relationship to the work. And I think that's why it's so interesting for us to talk to each other, not so much as a crit group, but to share the excitement of that process.
Mhm.
There's also, and we've spoken to one another about this before, the notion of weight, that all of this work, all of our work has weight. And I think that that is a result of us all identifying as sculptors or mixed media artists first, not painters or drafts people. So the weight of the object, or the, it's, we keep referring to these pieces as objects, even though they're drawings, but they're, I mean, hence the name material drawing, but the sense of weight is prevalent throughout all the work, whether it's Audrey's sitting on a surface, or my pieces leaning against the wall, or being held up by wood or metal. Julie's pieces that have the weight of a faux cement and juxtaposed against this really thin material, and then the weight of Deb's pieces on the floor.
Yeah.
So that is common, I think, to all of that, all of the work.
Although it's really interesting, when we were installing Deb's pieces and Julie's pieces, they are so light. There's this incredible lightness of being, I guess. I mean, they appear very weighty. There's a weight to them. There's this kind of, it communicates weight and the way it's carved out into space. But physically picking them up, they're very light. So
Yeah,
that's
we're all using these very kind of pretty simple materials, and Audrey's are, mostly kind of fabric or just, little, these small household objects. So, I think the weight comes from the layering and the labor. I mean, for me, the irony was, I started doing works on paper and doing some printmaking and monoprinting and embossing, blah, blah, just to work kind of a quicker way. And all the work in that show is very slow and meditative and
deliberate.
so it's not like a physical weight, it's a psychological, or I'm not quite sure maybe what the word is, but it's sort of this, there's a theatrics of how we take these materials and transform them, simple materials, and they become something else through the manipulation and through the labor.
Yeah.
And we also have this thing about line. I think a lot of us,
Yeah.
Audrey's stitching. When we first put Audrey and Julie's work together, I was like, oh my God, they used the same mark. And Audrey's was through stitching, and I don't know, with Julie's, I don't know what you did on it. Julie was like a tearing or whatever. Then there was, another layer of black on it, but it was, and then Michelle's was, torching and cracking. So, the graphic line is really, I think, also a kind of connection.
It's really interesting that, I'm listening to each one of us kind of like isolate one of the qualities that the work has. And I was thinking about, excuse me, about like, what is it about drawing that the four of us just can't get away from, right? As opposed to like, oh, we use drawing. It's one of these things where I don't think you could actually take drawing out of our studio practice and have us survive as artists. And I mean, I don't think so. But I also think it's like really interesting that we use drawing as a method. Like it's how we solve our visual problems.
Yeah.
Right. It's the thing that we use to like rectify space.
And it's not in preparation. I mean, the drawing that you're doing is not in preparation to, okay, now I'm going to make the real piece of art. You don't do a study. The drawing is not a study, but the drawing is actually part of the piece, and the process of getting there and actually working through the drawing is really the piece. That's the creation that you get, that you work through this to get to it. But
yeah, we've talked about that point, Catherine, that, you know, the material has meaning, and the choice of material has weight. And just by that alone, I mean, you know, as you said, we're not making drawings in preparation for something else. The drawing is, and we, you know, the final product is the drawing. So it's not about something else. But, you know, when you were talking about illusionistic space too, or the weight of pieces and how they appear to be heavy, but then you said you pick them up and they're so light. It's interesting because I think of illusionistic space more with two-dimensional drawing. That it's always about, or often about, creating illusionistic space on a flat surface.
Right.
And I love this idea of, you know, sort of rethinking this idea of weight. What is it really heavy? Or Deb's word, I think you used theatrics. That's got me thinking.
Oh, well, that's good.
Why this is all good for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
we
I
have
kind-
conversations sometimes. I want to take a pencil because we know each other's work so well, and there's always that insight. And I was like, oh my God, say that again about my work, because I don't know that one. I have to take notes on that one. It was.
Yeah, I have to think about that. Yeah. Well, I don't want to cut this off, but I'd kind of like to address the work that's actually in the gallery. And
I'll start. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because probably mine is the sort of most traditional in this show, because I don't have any of my installations, so it's all wall works on paper, kind of rectangularly formed. So these works were I take my installation elements and I deconstruct them and I run them through the press and to start and they become monoprints and then they become embossings because the elements are have density to them, so there's a you know, an impression that happens, and then I create not so much interested in the printmaking as a way to create a repository of images, and then which I take back into my studio, and then I start recomposing them and looking at them for information. And my work is always about kind of what the title of my last show is, holding the center still. It's a tension between a kind of impending explosion and the paper as almost an architectural space, which is compressing and holding together, you know, this feeling of built up tension. So I play around with cutting into the rectangle in some areas, and there's a lot of layering and a lot of layering that goes on, and a lot of the marks and the glyphs are made using black hot glue or tape. So I do go back into them with charcoal and pencil, but they're monochromatic. I try to get as lyrical as possible and as much color through my black and, you know, using this grisaille, you know, palette. So that's a little bit of, you know, background on my work.
Yeah, but there is you're right. I mean, there is a palette, even though it's black and white and gray. I mean, because there's, and I, you know, I guess I've been mostly, I remember the work that you've done in the past where you're thinking about fluorescence, you're thinking about tape that you've applied and put in layers. But I think the work that you've got, this work to me is, I really, really appreciate you talking about the pressure and putting it through a press and then being able to use that. And then, but they're composed, you know, and then some of them we've kind of, it's like you're starting off with a grid on some of the ones, and then you're trying to burst out of it. And then all of these are about this kind of energy where there's, they almost, the page can't contain it, and it's just spilling over, and there's these rough surfaces and edges, and I kind of feel like I'm in the middle of an explosion in the universe, that's happening when a star explodes.
Right, kind of teetering between
Mhm,
organization and chaos, so kind of,
mhm,
holding it together.
mhm,
The thing that is really important to me is, I mean, they're incredibly layered. And I was reading something by this anthropologist, this guy, Tim Ingold, who
mhm,
really talked about, the connection between optic and haptic,
mm,
there was actually, a canon and written literature on something that I just do intuitively, which is make things so tactile, because I think the tactility grabs the people and creates a charge. The emotional energy pulls them in.
mhm,
Where if it were just flat, I feel like it wouldn't have it. So there's just a plethora of, you know, stuff going on, whether it's patterning, well, whether it's a
mhm.
texture or, and it's kind of my job. My work is very Baroque. I'm trying to kind of pull it all together. When it's good, it's good. And when it's bad, it's like, okay, where's the,
Yeah,
let's kind of, get in there and give it a haircut, as someone once
yeah,
told me about my work. Just get in there and edit.
yeah, yeah.
um,
Or else run it through a press
again.
again. Um, maybe I remember when you and I were installing, we had originally talked about maybe separating it so there'd be four distinct spaces, and then we wanted to integrate it. And, the pieces that kind of immediately spoke to um, being put next to you were Julie's pieces, with the lines and the way it was reaching out. Julie, do you want to talk a little bit about, um, I know it's pretty simplistic to say, well, Julie's interested in architectural space, but could you begin to talk about some of the pieces that you have and I just have to say, I, I, I really loved getting up close to these. I'd seen the slides, but I really loved seeing them in person. But do you want to start talking about what you have in the show?
Yeah, several of I respond. The works evolve out, out of they're made of different materials to convey different aspects of
Um,
the way we incorporate the places we've lived and carry with us basically. And Several of the works came out of a collaboration with a poet, Audrey Henderson, who's Scottish, and she
mhm.
described the Edinburgh courthouse with these layers of black mat strikes from people waiting outside for their
Oh,
justice. And
yeah.
I was at the same time, I had a relative stuck in the court system and waiting for a really long time. And so we delve deep into her history with mining underneath Scotland and you can hear the miners in one of her houses she grew up, she could hear the
Mhm,
miners underneath. So that work, several of those works that you describe as looking like stone but made out of paper and paper with a little bit of plaster and pigment and glue,
mhm,
but come out of, they were cast from the process of actually making marks into clay and then
mhm,
making a mold and then pressing paper into the mold and then reconfiguring it and layering it.
mhm,
So that's sort of how those pieces came about. And in other pieces, I explore, which is generally what I do, light as it um, resonates through architecture and conveys the temporal nature of sense of place and
mhm,
sense of being in a place, and that's really historically always been the human condition, is we've had to move. It's not just a current condition.
mhm,
So there, and and it was a big part of my growing up, is I had to move around a lot. So I try to convey that how much you carry with you and that's in the work. But I love to play with architectural form and space and natural imagery as well. So
Mhm.
the marks are part of the process of the energy that it does try to convey the energy that is part of that process, the light and the shadow.
But I mean, maybe talk a little bit about the light and shadow, because a lot of the times you've used translucent paper and, you're
Yeah.
meant to see
So
through it. Yeah.
yeah, so historically I've worked with translucent resin and glass and uh, mylar, and when I've been, constructing drawings,
Mhm.
um, and I've used wood throughout my career because I have skills in a wide variety of materials, and that serves me well because I can sort of interconnect them and create space with them. And with the wood pieces, there's an example in the show of a piece that has translucent vellum and that's been printed on, um,
Mhm.
and with a wood block print and bamboo. And so that creates an architectural form, so that the shadow becomes part of the piece. And that's actually more the way I usually work.
Yeah.
It's the shadow becoming part of the piece. It's an interaction with the piece. And the constructions that I make create these shadows that create a feeling that the piece is moving, and
Mhm.
they become integral.
And the show that you just had at Boston Sculptors, a lot of it was about the shadow and how it was lit. The shadow was as much part of the piece. You were really drawing on the wall with light or negative light that was being blocked, became
Yeah.
part of the piece. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually work with light a lot while I'm working, and I work with the
Hmm.
shadows, and I actually, a lot of my imagery comes from shadow.
Hmm.
So as I'm working, I get ideas by casting light in different directions and getting ideas from different shapes and shadows that occur, and
Hmm.
um, and um, I don't know, it's just a really interesting medium uh, to to work with. I just endlessly fascinating.
Yeah.
It's the same principle because the shadow is a surprise. It comes up with a shape that isn't you don't that it reveals something about the form that you don't see when you're looking at the form.
uh, that sort of goes back to what we were saying about how, I forget which one of you said it, that there's a surprise that as
Mhm.
you're working through, and then you, there's the excitement and the surprise that happens when you're actually in process. I think what's, people who aren't, um, well, I think everybody is creative and sometimes doesn't realize how creative they are, but they were, it's making a piece of art or writing a piece of music or writing a piece of, using language to write. You don't know where you're going to go. You might have a vague idea, but the real work of getting someplace, you're not just filling in blank spaces. You're actually discovering as you're going along, and the work that is being done is the discovery and the process of getting there.
Mm.
So I think what you just said kind of says that beautifully. Michelle, I see you're on my screen right now. Maybe you're tapping or something, but that's making your picture get big. But could you talk about your piece?
Sure.
Your pieces, your collective
My
pieces,
collective pieces,
your
pages.
domestic, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's essentially a book, and it's a story about my Palestinian ancestry. My father's family was Palestinian. So
Mhm.
it's really a story about the partition of Palestine and the formation of Israel, and what happened to what was promised to the Jews, and what was not promised, I suppose, to the Palestinians. So that phrase "land of milk and honey" was used. I think there was even a musical called "Land of Milk and Honey" during that time
Yeah.
period. So that was a promise. And so the piece really is a way of questioning who the promise was made to, or the fallout of when one makes a promise to one person or country or whatever it might be, and not to, what the fallout is with that and what the repercussions are. So it's called Land of Milk and Honey, a story. I see the pages as really tablets, because the phrase "land of milk and honey" comes from the Bible.
Mhm.
And I wanted to really go back to the history. The conflict is so historical and
Yeah,
ancient
yeah,
and
yeah.
deeply embedded.
Mhm.
So that was a way of addressing that. And then, the pieces about loss and erasure. I started by making holes in the wood. I wasn't sure exactly where I was going with this piece. And typically and Deb will attest to this, I'm pretty, pretty linear. I mean, I got this idea, and I have a direction that I go in, and the work, of course, changes en route, but it's pretty mapped out, very almost the antithesis of what the way Deb approaches her work, for example.
Mhm. Mhm.
So this piece surprised me, because it wasn't that mapped out. And so I started by making holes in the wood and burning the wood. And I saved all the pieces of wood from the holes that I made
Mhm.
and used them in all the other pieces. So, in some of the pieces with the wax, and I should say also all the materials relate to milk and honey. So there's milk paint and there's beeswax.
And
So
it smells so good.
I had forgotten about that. Someone else mentioned it, you can still smell the burnt wood as well as the beeswax. But I embedded the wood into the wax. I burnt the wood. I burnt the plaster. I painted the tablets, and then I sanded off the paint. It was all a way of, again, of talking about loss and erasure. And for me, it was also a way of, I should say too, that I've done a whole series of pieces about the conflict and my Palestinian ancestry. And I've realized that that's been a way of connecting for me to personally connect with my father. And this piece in particular, I was really focused on it being more visceral. The other work was more ostensibly, it was decorative, and but it had a covert message to it. But this work, I really wanted to see if I could make something very visceral. And so, it was kind of a surprise to me, that the shelves seemed to be a good way of displaying the book and to talk about the weight of the pages and, of course, the weight of the conflict
Yeah.
as well. So it's been kind of cathartic to me, and it's also been interesting for me to talk about the piece with other people.
Mhm. What
and-
kind of reactions have you gotten?
Usually it's very, I think it's a powerful piece for most people, I have to say, and that's made me feel good. I mean, I'm not a writer. I'm not going to write about this conflict. I can't. I mean, I don't know how to do that powerfully. But I think for all of us as artists, I mean, clearly our language is a visual language. So when we can impact anyone with what it is that we're doing in any way, it feels very empowering, and I'm grateful to be able that my work can do that.
Audrey, I love this artist book. It's just, I've spent a lot of time when I've been back at Catamount looking at it, and it's just been really, I hope it has many other opportunities to be seen. So Anyway, Audrey, I didn't mean to have you be last, but I went in and I wasn't there when you installed the pieces, but they're just so, you know, I kept wanting to touch them and I kept thinking, yeah, I guess I can touch them because I'm a curator, but I really shouldn't. You know? Okay, can you start talking about them? Because, and what you did, they're just beautifully placed. And Deb and I were trying to find the podium, the right podium in the way. And I said, you know, let Audrey figure out how she wants to place these when she comes. And I think you just did such a nice job. They're gorgeous.
It was really fun installing. Say it was just like, oh, look, and you know, just made a little city. Excuse me. And somebody's mowing their lawn, so I apologize if it gets really loud.
Can't hear it.
Good. So it's really, I'm very happy to hear that you want to touch the work because it was made to be touched. The little guys are
Uh-huh.
called the handhelds. And they were part of a larger body of work that I'm one of those epic movie making type of people. So I take 3 years to build a show. And I'm like Deb's talking about being Baroque-esque. I'm like Baroque on acid or something. It's like, I need more. So I had built a show that was exhibited during the pandemic. It was about time and shadows and memory.
Mhm.
And what it used as its tools was flotsam and jetsam from a house.
Oh,
That
wow. Yeah.
It was the house that I grew up in. My mother had lived in for 65 years.
Yeah.
So, and my parents were antique dealers. So just, you know,
Oh my God.
right. So just
Got a lot.
expand that by 3,000. And
Yeah.
that's how much stuff we had to take apart. And that was the summer before the pandemic. And there was this kind of, I'm a sculptor. I love thingness, right?
Uh-huh.
The whole notion of objectness is really important for me because it talks about history, it talks about being, it talks about culture, it talks about what needs to change, where all the money goes. You know, there's so many layers
Yeah.
that happens when you're looking at a single object.
Yeah.
Who made it, who used it, who threw it away, et cetera, et cetera. How did they throw it away?
Yeah.
And so that whole kind of notion of like material histories, I wasn't looking at the objects I was throwing out or boxing and giving to different, you know, siblings and my mom, but
Yeah.
I was really looking at what was left over when
Uh-huh.
I took the house apart. And
Yeah.
so what I ended up doing was taking objects that were really importantly insignificant, right? That
Yeah.
they had no value and they were really going to go into, they couldn't even like be thrift stored,
Yeah.
right?
They would be.
They had no further life.
Uh-huh.
And so I was like looking for things that were completely meaningless, figuring out how they came together. So I was at that point working with silk, translucent silk. So everything ended up getting wrapped in a silk cocoon. And that silk cocoon for me ended up being about isolation of the pandemic.
Oh my goodness. Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
it's like we're only seeing each other on screens
Yeah.
and the embodiment was completely missing.
Yeah.
And so that's where the silk came in. That
Yeah.
everything had its little cocoon and it was isolated and
Uh-huh.
unlike a creature cocoon, right, which is only used as a kind of like a dressing room until it transforms into something else. This is not changing.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like a shroud.
Yeah, well, yes, there's that too, except they were, I was using like joyful colors.
Yeah.
Just because I, had to live with myself psychologically.
Yeah.
but also, and then I was putting them together. And the rule that I created for myself, because I love rules,
Mhm.
is I was playing with, had to be 5 objects.
Mhm.
And that was it. I was limiting myself to 5 objects because I wanted something to be held in the hand
Mhm.
by viewers.
Yeah, yeah. And
So it was really made to be an embodied experience for
and
people.
you didn't intend us to pick these up, did you? So
Yeah.
oh, you did. Oh, okay. So I
The
should
little ones.
okay. So I shouldn't hold back. So when I go back to the gallery, I should carefully examine them.
Yeah, only the small ones. The big ones are like, they're just too big. You need 2 hands to
Right.
hold them.
Right.
So
right.
the little guys that have 5 objects, they have a clue on them, just so you know how to put them back in their little, like, hi, I'm a sculpture form.
Yeah.
Which is on the bottom 3, they all mostly rest on 3 prongs.
Yeah.
On the bottom of the 3 prong is a little bit of black thread.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
that is the ground. So you know
that's
how
the
it
ground. Okay.
fits.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That's
Yeah.
yeah. So would you say that these are you said you needed to live with yourself, that's why you use these joyful colors. But I think your work often has color. I mean, you seem to, yeah, I mean that really seems to be something that you're drawn to. I mean, Deb's range of colors are from black and white to gray with multiple shades of gray, but you're kind of painting with a different palette. So you've always done this? I mean, that's what I've seen of your work. Is that true?
I grew up as a painter.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. And when did you start doing sculpture?
I'm sorry, they're
When did you,
mowing again.
yeah, no, when did you start
Oh
primarily?
gosh. After I gave birth.
Oh.
The whole notion of the female body completely changed when I had a kid inside me.
Yeah.
And delivering a child was the most embodied experience I'd ever had. And so creating illusion
Mhm,
got really boring after that.
mhm, hmm.
I bored myself. I was just like, I'm not into it anymore. So I started making things that had a physicality to
They
them.
were embodied, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. That's
So, that whole notion of like, somebody was talking about the connection between optic and haptic.
Deb was, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and I love optics, but I need to see in my work, if I don't feel it
Mhm.
physically in my body, I can't get it out of the studio.
Wow.
So that's my making process. It's like, I have to be able to, I have to understand whatever I'm making, like internally, physically,
Yeah.
before I can say, yes, somebody else is now allowed to look at it.
That's really, I think sculpture lends itself to that, because it really is that 3 dimensionality. It's not a trick of the eye. You're not using perspective. You're not using trompe l'oeil. You're not using something to fool the eye into thinking. You're actually presenting something that is fully formed.
Yeah, but there's a whole tradition of sculpture, the
Mm.
minimalist one, that is, the hand is not involved at all, and it's
Oh
not,
my gosh, yes, yeah.
you know what I mean? There's nothing, tactile in some ways about it, or,
Yeah.
it
I think
can
all
be
of us
cold
have,
and sterile.
there's a
Um,
immersive quality to
Yeah,
all
yeah.
of our works, yeah.
Mhm.
Right.
Or some of the sculpture that was being done in the, I guess, 90s, early 2000s, where I saw one exhibition once where there was not actually a piece in it, but there were only instructions that were given. There was nothing in it except the instructions that were given to the installer for how to install the piece. And I mean, it was that conceptual. So it's nice to see the embodiment of the conception in all of your work. So this has been such a great conversation. I mean, thank you so much, because you've been all so generous and willing to share how you approach these pieces that I just am completely in love with, and I'm so glad that we're being able to show it and then being able to have this conversation right now. Is there anything else that anybody wants to say as we're wrapping up and kind of finalizing this?
Well, I just wanted to comment on the richness of friendship and the richness of collegiality, and how, we're not a co-op, and we're not, it's not a crit group. It's just, I think community of artists busting the myth of doing it alone, and the conversations that we've had for 20 years at this point is so important to me, and is my development and my thought process. So I want to honor my cohort here and thank you for having a great fourth show together.
And I wanted to thank Catherine for being a wonderful curator and really guiding us through one of our shows and really selecting the work. She went to all of our studios and for a previous show and selected the work and wrote a beautiful essay about it. So she set a high standard that has come forward, and I just want to thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, and I was asked to give a talk once, and it was supposedly about curating. And one of the things I said is that artists can exist perfectly well without curators. You're going to do what you do. You're going to go to your studio. You're going to hopefully, and what Deb said, talk with each other in the best of all possible worlds and have work communicate with each other. But curators need artists. Artists don't need curators. I couldn't do anything if it weren't for all of you doing what you do. So I guess, can I say thank you back?
I would argue with that point,
Oh
Catherine.
dear. Oh, good. Okay. That's
Yeah,
enough.
because
Yeah.
as someone who's been, blessed to have conversations with curators, yourself included, the conversation is a different one than the one I have with my colleagues here.
Mhm.
And it's one that brings in a breadth of points of view that I don't always have access to because I don't think like that.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
I think about like, what's the weight of that nail? And, did I strip that screw head? Right. That kind of technical stuff. And it's a really important conversation for us
Yeah.
to be able to hear, what a curator can bring into our own work.
Although I think that if you had I think that kind of thinking that a curator has brings a self-consciousness that if you were trying to work and actually create work and be creative from the mindset that I might bring to it, you might not be able to create the work. I think that the conversation opens it up, but as a writer, I know I need a good editor. I know the conversations I have with editors are great, but if I start thinking in an editorial way, then I can't get it out. So I maybe we both need each other.
We both need each
Exactly.
other.
Okay.
But Catherine, you saw connections between different works of ours that
Mhm.
we might not have seen,
That's right.
and formed a line between, you formed this wonderful conversation that was a conversation we were having, but we might not have seen it the way you saw different things and put them together. So it is a collaboration in that sense.
Okay, well, I will take that.
Accept that.
So
Thank you.
Oh, really, thank you so much. This has been a
Wonderful
great
opportunity.
conversation. So,